Abhorash, the greatest of all his kind, in life and in death, the indirect creator of the Blood Dragon's Vampiric Order of Knights, and a figure of legend. His is a tragic tale of a noble soul turned and twisted against his will by a curse that forced him to murder his countrymen and would let him live to see the ruin of everything he cherished. But unlike almost all others of his ilk, he never surrendered to his curse and refused to embrace it until he could finally find a cure for his unnatural thirst. One that he eventually did discover. But we are getting somewhat ahead of ourselves. Abhorrash's story begins more than 1,700 years before the beginning of the imperial calendar, far to the south in the distant desert lands of Nehekhara and the great city of Lamia. It was ruled over by King Lamajizar and his sister wife Nefereta. Lamajizar was a hero of the Great War against Nagash and had been instrumental in defeating the vile necromancer and scourging his taint from the lands of Nehekhara. He had even managed to capture one of Nagash's most trusted lieutenants, Arkan the Black, and had brought him back to Lamia in disgrace and chains. Or at least, that was the official story, told to the entire population and, no doubt, to Abhorash as well. He was the finest of all the warriors in Lamia, and Nehekhara was never the most peaceful or stable of lands. It was a place steeped in near constant turmoil. Each of the many city-states had their own ruling elites of kings and queens, many of which often competed with one another for power and influence, both in the more political ways and often also in far more overtly violent ways. Border conflicts were no doubt a frequent occurrence, as one king or another disagreed with a third or a fourth party about the precise lines that were to be drawn in the desert sands. Unsurprisingly, warriors therefore were highly prized and honored, and foremost amongst all of them in Lamia was Abhorrash, whose loyalty belonged to only one man, the hero king Lamajizar, who had been alive for an oddly long time at this point. He had gone to war with the great necromancer 80 years ago, and not only was he still alive, remarkable in and of itself, he was quite spry as well. Well, blessed by the gods, no doubt, and the people of Lamia thought no more about it. And you can hardly blame them. I imagine criticizing the king was a fairly serious offense back in ancient Lamia. Though perhaps someone should have dug a little bit deeper into the king's secrets, as the reason for his unnatural longevity was considerably darker than the blessing of a god or two. When Arkan the Black was brought to Lamia, it was not really as a prisoner, you see, but rather as a resource. Lamajizar had originally offered his services to Nagash, not the other kings of Khemri, but he had demanded that Nagash share with him the secret to immortality and eternal life. Unfortunately for him, Nagash had spent quite a lot of time, resources, and a handful of slices of his soul to concoct the elixir of life, and he wasn't about to give it up quite so easily. And so the king of Lamia joined the other kings of Khemri in defeating Nagash. But as the outcome of the war grew ever more certain, Arkhan decided that he might be better off playing both sides. And so he surrendered himself to Lamajizar, offering up the secret that he had asked of Nagash. Now, Arkhan himself did not know the full recipe either, but as he brought with him the books of Nagash into captivity, he felt confident he could develop it. Unfortunately, Lamajizar was not particularly mystically inclined, and so had to ask the aid of his wife and sister, incidentally, Nefereta, who was a priestess of Neru, and had plentiful knowledge of the magical arts. Guided yet further down the path of darkness and necromancy by Arkhan, the two managed to concoct a lesser elixir, which granted them both extended lives. It may not have been a potion of true immortality, yet it is nevertheless a feat of alchemy virtually unmatched in the history of Warhammer. There were some other problems, though. Lamajizar was the king and the unquestioned ruler of Lamia, except when he was away on campaign, like the one to defeat Nagash, for example. And the second in command, of course, was Neferata, and she had acquired quite the taste for leadership. But unfortunately, her husband returned and delegated her to a primarily ceremonial role once more. And after 80 years of nurturing that grudge, she was starting to get just about sick of playing second fiddle. Conspiring together with Arkhan, she managed to concoct a true potion of immortality, or at the very least something a hell of a lot closer to Nagash's original product. The possession of this miraculous cure, of course, gave her a pretty damn solid negotiation position, and she was able to bribe the overwhelming majority of Lamajizar's once loyal supporters with the promise of eternal life. And the king was swiftly reduced to nothing more than a puppet, a figurehead, something to be dusted off occasionally and used for ceremonial purposes. And certainly not to be given access to the potion. Oh, no, no, no. You see, Nefereta had thought this through. Considering Nagash's little temper tantrum that had almost destroyed the entirety of Nehekara, she realized that the populace may not take particularly well to new immortal rulers, and so she had planned to fake her own death, and instead rule through her son. Tragically, for the queen at the very least, she never got quite that far, as Lamajizar turned out to be a far sorer loser than Neferata. He was not gonna let his grudge fester for 80-odd years before making his move, probably realizing that he didn't have 8 months, much less 80 years. He gathered to him his few loyal retainers that remained. Abhorash was one of them, and he concocted a plan to have the queen killed with the venom of a sphinx. And much to the rejoicing of the king and his supporters, this plot succeeded. But they had not reckoned with Arkhan the Black, who not only managed to fight his way back into the palace and to Neferata's seemingly dead corpse, where he tried to resurrect her by infusing her with his own magic, which at first seemed to fail, but as we all know, it did not. It turned Neferata into the first of the vampires. But more directly relevant to our current character of interest, Abhorrash, Arkin then, after having apparently failed, broke into the king's portion of the palace, slaughtering yet further of his supporters and eventually killing the king himself moments before being cut down by Abhorrash. Having seemingly defeated the last of the vile queen's champions, Abhorrash must have looked around himself and seen a court in absolute disarray. Corridors slick with blood and gore, and no clear lineage to take up the reins of leadership. Yet in the midst of all the chaos, the Grand Vizier of Lamia announced that the Queen had miraculously survived. And loyal, as always, to his kingdom, Abhorrash had no other choice than to swear fealty to the woman he had just plotted to have assassinated. And seeing the value of a fine warrior, the immortal queen accepted. One imagines Abhorrash swiftly grew to somewhat regret his hasty decision to simply continue his debt of loyalty, however, as Lamia changed rather drastically, as the new queen introduced an extensive system of blood orgies. That was undoubtedly quite a U-turn, but one, surprisingly enough, embraced by the majority of Lamia's upper crust. Perhaps encouraged by the fact that whilst the Queen did look a little off these days, and she did eat an awful lot of people, she was still immortal. And that was, as always, a pretty damn tempting prospect. But not to Abhorrash. Seeing what had become of the rest of the court, he resisted any attempts to have him drink the queen's blood, thereby turning him into a vampire as well. But he was tricked into doing it. Horrified at what he had become and the growing urge to drink blood, he refused to feed. And that worked out about as well as you can imagine, as after having held out for longer than most, he finally succumbed to absolute frenzy one night and slaughtered over a dozen people. An act of massacre that very nearly drove Abhorrash insane with the guilt of it all. Incidentally, I guess no one in Lamia figured that, maybe we could just take a little bit of blood and then drink as needed, instead of just, emptying people out. Seems a hint wasteful, but hey, details. Now, the topic of waste, Abhorrash seems to have been the only reasonable one in the new court of the undead. He argued that the vampires needed to limit themselves. They should not feed upon the people of Lamia, and when they had to feed, they should only do so in moderation, preferably from the desert-dwelling nomads outside the walls. And they certainly shouldn't go around shouting their newfound immortality at anyone who wanted to listen. It seems as if 80 years after the defeat of Nagash, Abhorash was literally the only person left that remembered just how much of a massive panic was caused in Nehekara the last time the dead started walking about. But, of course, his advice was completely and utterly ignored by the Queen and her court as they continued to gorge themselves on blood. They even grew so confident that the Queen called for a grand banquet where she invited other kings and queens to come to attend to see her court and be put at ease. The evil rumors surrounding the excesses of her court were just that, vile rumors, spread by the jealous and the dissatisfied few. At this point, Abhorrash had already left the court in disgust. Having vowed to never again feed on the people of Lamia, he had sequestered himself in the desert. Though he was always nearby and he kept up with the goings-ons at court, since he still felt bound by his oath of loyalty. And that might have been a good thing too, at least for the Queen, as her message of peace, understanding, and nothing at all being vampiric or wrong in Lamia was somewhat undermined by the fact that she killed Khalida Neferhir, another queen, in single combat, and then drained her dry of blood in front of the other guests. That is some Eldar level of diplomacy right there. Unsurprisingly, this did not work to Lamia's favor, and every single one of the other kingdoms of Nehekhara declared war on Lamia with the unified intent of wiping out every single last one of those sharp-fanged little bastards. At first, Queen Neferetta saw no real reason to be overly worried. Sure, the other kings and queens were a potential threat, yes, but she was a demigod now, the first vampire, and she had built a significant court, a sisterhood of fellow vampires. And she could also count on the service of Abhorash, who returned to the city to defend it against its enemies, even if doing so meant that he would have to fight for everything he loathed. What threat could the mortal armies of the priest kings be? Ashur Nagash thought something remarkably similar. It turns out that people scared out of their minds and also backed into a corner by an emergent vampire threat tend to be rather determined when it comes to fighting. Any other mortal army may have broken thrice over at the slaughter that the vampires unleashed upon the mortal warriors of the Nehekharan kings. Abhorrash alone slew hundreds upon hundreds of soldiers, but was forced back by overwhelming numbers step by step. First off the walls, then through the city streets, then onto the very steps of the royal palace itself. The corpses fell in mounds all around him, and yet for every one of the warriors he cut down, a dozen slipped past and began flooding into the palace, until eventually Abhorrash and a handful of others were all that remained of Lamia. The kingdom Abhorrash had sworn undying fealty to was now nothing more than rubble and blood-stained brick. On the one hand, everything he had lived for was gone. On the other, everything he had died for was also gone. The bonds of loyalty that tied him to a throne he no longer believed in was gone. His people, the things that had kept him loyal, was also gone. There was no reason to remain loyal to Neferetta any longer. If she lived, that is, which, of course, she did. The next time the two would meet, it would not be as master and servant. Abhorrash began traveling the land once more, seeking some sort of purpose, some aim, some reason for his continued tortured existence. For a time, he found it in the city Bel Aliad, where he became one of the foremost members of the city and also trained a special mounted cavalry unit known as the Contoy. It was at the head of these lancers that Abhorrash was reunited with his mistress. Neferata led a band of desert raiders against the city, intent on seizing it and undoubtedly doing unspeakable things to the population. Abhorrash and his warriors put a concise end to that plan, however, with Abhorrash personally impaling Neferata on his lance and sending her handmaidens, carrying her mutilated corpse, scrabbling back into the desert. It was, however, a temporary reprieve at best, as Nagash once again re-emerged and launched his plagues across Nehekhara. Neferata would eventually seize control over the city through means of to flee again. Up until this point, he had remained with a group of other vampires, those who had remained loyal to the king, but Abhorrash had come to denounce his previous masters and the ruin they brought upon his home. And so he set off alone with only a small gathering of followers, divesting himself of Nehekharan vampire society. This is also when his own view on life, or unlife more correctly, began to be made apparent. His small gathering of followers became his disciples, as he taught them everything he knew of combat. He trained them into an elite formation of warriors, but more so than just that, also, he taught them an unyielding code of honor and ethics in battle, where the only measure of a man, or a monster, was found in martial prowess. This was also used as a justification to continue feeding. Abhorash had learned his lesson from the last time he had tried to abstain from blood entirely. But he put down an ironclad rule. He and all those who followed him would only feed from the greatest of fighters and the most lethal of warriors. Perhaps even in some sort of suicidal quest, as Abhorrash despised his condition as a vampire and was looking indirectly for a cure, a permanent one in this case. And he also made it absolutely clear that to feed from the weak was the lowliest and most despicable of acts, utterly unworthy of him or anyone who professed to be a disciple of his. This foundation of a discipline, of an order of warriors, gave Abhorrash once again some semblance of purpose, though the far greater purpose that came to him later in his undead life was the creation of the Strigos Empire in Morcaine. This was a rather famous nation of the night, shall we say, founded by the vampire Ushoran, another one, incidentally, of Neferata's old inner circle. He had created what he likened to a fresh Lamia, one that would not repeat the errors of the old days, and would prove once and for all that the undead vampire aristocracy, a term just beginning to form, could rule just as well as any other hereditary ruler. This spoke to Abhorrash on a deep personal level. The need to be loyal to something, to someone other than himself, was clearly something that appealed to him greatly. And Abhorrash served in Ushoran and Morcaine's ranks for several hundred years, and he had more than enough to keep himself busy. Morcaine's location and the ambitions of its ruler brought it into continued conflict with the various savage monsters on its border, the ogre tribes to the east, and countless innumerable hordes of orcs and greenskins. Abhorrash himself quite literally saved the Empire on more than one occasion, at one point even slaying a giant in single combat, after having already masterminded the military strategy that would see a vast greenskin horde crushed by the Strigos Empire. But just like in the old Lamia, many hundreds of years ago, even a warrior and a strategist the likes of Abhorash could not win out against insurmountable numbers, as Strigos was eventually crushed beneath the bulk of the green-skinned hordes. For a long time, Abhorrash's survival was in question, and even now no one quite knows how he managed to get out of the Empire without being buried beneath its rubble like everybody else. But he did eventually re-emerge, again with a small but hyper-dedicated band of followers. Judging by Abhorrash's personality up until this point, he had undoubtedly been wandering the land looking for strong opponents, perhaps even somebody good enough to put him down as well. Or failing that, some fresh reason to continue to drag out his hellish existence. And he found it. Oh boy, did he find it. Rumors reached him of a mountain, seemingly constantly surrounded by fire and smog, rumored to be inhabited by a monstrous worm that had been preying upon local communities. Abhorash, seeing an opportunity to fight a truly potent foe, and probably a good chance of getting himself baked in his armor as well, set off at once to face the creature. And, just as promised, upon reaching the pinnacle of the mountain, he was faced with a red dragon. Anyone less suicidal would at this point be running away in fear and terror, but again, Abhorash has different motivations than most, so he simply drew his sword, gave the monster a salute, and waded on into combat. Now, how anyone, no matter how vampiric they may be, could possibly kill a critter the size of a Walmart and armored like a Merkava, I will never know. But Abhorrash did it, armed simply with a small chunk of sharpened metal. And as it happened, Abhorrash was absolutely famished. His self-imposed rule of only feeding from the most lethal of monsters was well and truly fulfilled with this victim, and so he sunk his teeth into the great lizard's neck and drained it dry. And in the name of pedantry, I am forced to raise an objection at this point. How many hundreds of liters of vital fluid must be inside of a dragon? Surely more than enough to make a human-sized vampire pop like a grape. But oh well, again, details. And once he finished, Abhorrash realized with a shock that his thirst was quenched. The driving, gouging hunger that had gnawed at him for the last 1,000 years plus was gone. He had found the cure for his condition. Or, more precisely, he had found an incredibly effective medicine. All one needed to do to escape from the shackles of needing to continuously feed upon the blood of mortals was to eat an entire dragon. I don't understand why no one thought of this before, frankly. I mean, again, there must have been a lot of blood in the thing. Regardless of the miraculous nature of the cure, Abhorrash was free. But he also realized that this was not a feat that everyone could mimic. And so he told his followers what he had discovered, and ordered them all to scatter across the land in search of their own beasts, but first and foremost the skills required to best the monsters. He himself would wait here at the pinnacle of the mountain for his disciples to return, so that one day, when he had an army of immortal vampires who did not need to feed, he could get his proper vengeance on everyone who had ever taken from him. And that is where the story of Abhorrash seems to end, though there are myths and legends surrounding him as well, such as that he met Giles Le Breton, the famous founder and unifier of Bretonia. Apparently the two dueled and Abhorrash lost. Or at the very least, Giles proved himself a worthy enough opponent for Abhorrash to swear an oath of service to him, though not a permanent one. His debt to Giles was something that could be repaid, and he did so through service and through the construction of La Maisontal Abbey. As for the rest, Abhorrash is perhaps most famous for the actions of his get. Abhorrash himself was known as the Red Dragon, a title he first received in the Strigos Empire in Morcaine, where he wore red iron armor, shaped like the scales of a mighty worm. Eventually, the red became more associated with blood, and his followers became known as the Blood Knights. Though whether this was due to Abhorrash's armor and his nickname, or due to the actions of one of Abhorrash's disciples, is somewhat more difficult to parse, because originally the Order of the Blood Dragon was an imperial order of knights, much like the Knights Panthers, for example. They were stationed in Blood Keep, a fortress guarding one of the many entrances and exits to Bretonia, the two human nations having an oft disagreeable history between themselves. One day, a man naming himself Balak arrived at the fortress and challenged each and every knight inside its walls to single combat. They probably laughed their asses off at first. One man against an order of knights? Even if they were to fight him one by one, there was no way he would survive that, right? Well, Balak was not a man, obviously. And so, as each and every member of the Order stepped up to do combat, he cut them down like children. Until, when dawn finally arrived, they were all dead. Balak then choosing to resurrect the finest swordsman amongst them to form the Order of the Blood Dragon, as we know it today. Or perhaps more accurately, as we knew it. As the Order, which now began to feed upon the people they were supposed to protect, didn't last all that long. But that will be a tale for some other time. With that, I will wrap up this lore video on Abhorrash. Almost a lore video on Lamia as well, but that is a wider subject too, for perhaps another video as well. And some of you may question, Arch, putting out a video on a bloodthirsty leech considering current events? Is this some sort of commentary, perhaps? And I can reassure you, no, it is not in any way a commentary on a certain English corporation, because frankly, Abhorrash is a far nobler soul. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.